as part of the European art and artists, now we will look at post-impressionism and the artists who are called as post-impressionist artists, and who had a sort of a link with the impressionism that preceded. Post-impressionism was a term that was given in the later half of the first decade of 20th century, that is around 1909-10. But when these artists were painting in the late 19th century, they didn't know that they were doing something called post-impressionism. So post-impressionism was termed by the later critics and art historians. Particularly it was given by someone called Roger Fry, a formalist critic, a British formalist critic. So however, so we'll look at the artists and look at their practice largely, and looking at the images and what kind of images that they have produced. So post-impressionism comes like historically in terms of time, it comes after impressionism, around 80s, 90s and into the, so around 1880s, 1890s. So those were the years when artists ventured into painting in a manner which was influenced by impressionism but differed from impressionism. That is very important. How post-impressionism differed. Post-impressionism wanted to make impressionism more solid and durable, because if we look at impressionist paintings, they are more fleeting in appearance. They do not look quite durable or quite solid in terms of composition and appearance. They appear as if they are just, glimpses of the fleeting moments. The artists have just captured a momentary aspect of time, So both in terms of the composition or in terms of what they were painting. They were not painting something historically significant. If we think about conventionally how historically significant paintings were done before. So their themes were not historically significant. So their paintings were not engaged in terms of thinking about composition or thinking about the themes that they were painting. So it was largely capturing light and the way the light falls and the celebratory dimension of modernism, right? Or to kind of capture the city and the city culture and the expansion of the city. So that was impressionism. What happened with post-impressionism that comes after, a generation after impressionism, is these artists have combined the impressionist goals, that which is light, shade and color. So light as the natural light, and the shading used with, like, shading done not in the way the neoclassical artists used to do, but here shading with the help of color, So with an analysis of the structure of the given subject. So unlike impressionists, in the context of post-impressionists, these artists have actually engaged with the structure of painting, engaged with the composition of painting. So it was a sort of an analytical, engaged approach towards painting. Not just capture what you see, but how you see, So if an artist, a post-impressionist artist, is looking at a landscape, he's not capturing what he's seeing in front of his eyes, but he's analyzing what he's seeing through his way of seeing. So the way of seeing is more important when it comes to post-impressionism, and that way of seeing, how you look at something, that is informed and influenced by the individual interests and sensibilities. These are the important factors of post-impressionism, and these individual sensibilities and temperaments or interests, they lend into the formation of individual languages of art, individual visual experimentation and individual visual languages informed by the emotions or not emotions, which was not the case with Impressionism. So, post-Impressionism, the artists of post-Impressionism have introduced the notion of individuality into the painting. This is a very important point to note. The notion of artistic individuality with the individual visual language in terms of thematic, in terms of the way they have painted. Not only language here means both the way they have rendered the themes as well as what kind of themes that they chose, right. So, they moved towards abstraction, but retained solid forms. So, what happened here when I am saying the way of seeing, what they were doing is they are trying to abstract a structure from the nature and repaint it in the canvas. So, there is some kind of a translation that is happening in the context of post-Impressionism, not just capturing what is seen, but what is seen is translated through the experiences, interests, temperaments, feelings and the individual interests of the artist, right, and that is painted. So, this is very important when it comes to post-Impressionist moment, right. So, this is what is abstraction, they are abstracting and then redoing it, but retain solid forms, explore underlying structure, preserve perspective despite slight abstraction. So, when you look at Impressionist paintings, they sort of didn't care about perspective, they didn't care about structure or composition, but these artists wanted to bring back the stability of the structure of composition. So, so they sort of engaged with the problems of painting, problems of representation and the composition or compositional analysis, right. So, these are important sort of differences that we have between Impressionism and post-Impressionism. So, we have a few very important artists like Cézanne, Van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Lothar, Suroor, and you have other artists also who worked with different languages that do not have any link with Impressionism. But these are the artists that we are going to see now. They sort of departed from Impressionism. They were influenced by Impressionism, but they moved away from the Impressionism and made their own individual contributions to the modern art of Europe. So, let us look at Paul Cézanne. Cézanne dedicated himself to the objective transcription of what he called sensations of nature. He did not paint what he saw, right? He sort of painted what he sensed. He analyzed the forms of nature. What he said is, don't look at nature as it is, reduce the forms of nature into the basic geometric forms, cylinder, cone and a sphere, right. So, he had a different approach to looking at nature. So, he sort of tried to transcribe the objective nature, transcribe what he is seeing with a certain amount of objectivity, no emotion, but almost like a mathematical analytical approach, right. So, didn't want to capture transitory effects like you see in the context of Impressionism. Let's look at Monet. If you look at Monet, he wanted to just capture the effects of light, the transitory moment and the effects of light. So, he didn't want to do that. I wanted to capture a sense of order in nature, right. So, and through methodical application of color. So, he introduced a way of applying color, juxtaposing patches of color one after another, and by that juxtaposition, by that methodical application, he constructed a body of the paint, a body of the forms. So, he blended drawing and modeling into one process. So unlike the conventional ways of painting where you draw and then you fill the color in the drawing, he didn't do that. He sort of blended drawing, the outline, into the modeling. That is very important, where you have the forms sort of bleed into it. We can see when we look at the images where the forms bleed into each other and construct a whole body, a unified body of the form. So he wanted to make Impressionism more solid and durable. So these are the things that he said. He wanted to make Impressionism more solid and durable and make Impressionism that could be housed in the museums. So he wanted to kind of create art that can be put in the museums. And Impressionism, as he saw, was not something that can be that is equal to something that can be kept in the museums, displayed in the museums. So he wanted to make Impressionism that is solid and durable so that you can equate it with something that you can display in the museums. So this is the beginning of Paul Cézanne. Let us look at his work. The slide that you see now is a painting called Mount Saint Victor. Mount Saint Victor, he painted over 30 canvases, 30 paintings of the same mountain, right, from different angles. So before going further into this painting, let me just give you little information about Cézanne. Cézanne participated in the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, but he was not received at all. He was not well received at all. He was criticized badly and he was depressed. And he went back to the place he came from, which is Aix-en-Provence. And he was disappointed and he returned and he wanted to paint from there. So he started painting, and he also traveled a little along with Camille Pissarro, and he was very much influenced by Pissarro. And you can look at Pissarro's work, and we have discussed in the other lecture. So he was very much influenced by Pissarro, and he painted along with, he learned a lot from Pissarro, and particularly the structural analysis of the pictorial composition. So now let us look at this painting. So he painted this over 30 or 36 times from different angles, and what he painted is not what his eye captured actually. So he wanted to paint round and firm objects, but not that that were geometric and made from splashes of undiluted color, right? So rounded forms, firm objects, but those firm objects are made by using the geometric treatment and the splashes of undiluted color. It's like not mixing on the palette, but you kind of directly paint on the canvas. And he's also the artist who introduced blank canvas onto the painting. Before that, the entire canvas used to be painted, but Cézanne is the first artist who introduced leaving the canvas unpainted in some areas where you needed white. So he really revolutionized painting, and he's also considered as the father of modern painting, right? And he created perspective and depth through juxtaposing warm colors and cool colors. So warm colors for forward, they come forward, and cool colors would recede, they would go back, right? In the sense, when you look at the painting, warm colors would come forward, your eye reacts, responds immediately, and then for the cool colors, they take your eye in, they create a sense of depth, they recede inside. So he created perspective by using this sort of combination of colors, but not perspective in the conventional sense. It is not color perspective, but color is used in a different way altogether. And this could be possible because the artist already knew the color theory, you know. So what are the contrast colors, complementary colors, the color, the nature of color, you know, how the color perform with your eye. So it is not the countryside of Impressionism, more interested in geometric forms than dabbled sunlight, right. So, he was more interested in geometric character of the forms, and you can see that how he is transforming the forms into a geometric effect. So, if you look at the composition, you have a sense of triangle, right. You have mountain like that, and you have a sense of horizon. So, what he does is he sort of mixes, so it sits like this. The mountain almost like sits with a sense of heaviness, a sense of gravity, and you can see the application of colors are not according to the shape of the form, but he is applying colors flatly, right. That is a methodical application of color. He is applying color flatly, one pigment after another, or one hue of the color after another, and he is creating a sense of depth and of forward and receding, that effect. And you can see that if you spend a time and look at it closely, and you have a sense of horizontal line right beneath the mountain here, a sort of a bridge, and then you have small houses. So, and after that in the foreground it is a sort of a network of color patches, right, network of brushwork, and then it creates a sense of repetition of the mountain that you have in the top, but this is distributed with the help of the trees and the houses that you have in the foreground, right. But if you look at the color application, he is not using the logic of color perspective. If you look at the color intensity in the foreground, it is the same intensity that you see in the background also, on the mountain also, but the logic he is applying here is the this particular juxtaposition, the methodical color application, right. So, he made painting as an analysis actually, right. So, let us look at his other painting. So, he painted this landscape extensively, and then he is known for his still lifes. The slide that you see is one of the examples of his still lifes, where he painted it in 1893, quite before what we saw now, right. What we saw was an evolved one. Now we are going back, where you have a still life which is painted indoor, and he painted several still lifes like this using using fruits, particularly apples and round fruits. What you see here is a normal still life, right, and you have the bottle in the center. The bottle is tilted, which is very unusual, right. He is tilting the bottle, right, and you have the fruit ball, the fruit basket is again tilted, and it appears as if everything is coming towards the viewer, right. And right at the bottom you have this cloth, the drapery. The drapery looks very heavy, right. The drapery looks as if it is very solid. It acquires a sense of gravity, right. So, he used strong painterly brush strokes to create that, contrasting nature of round objects, flat objects and drapery. So, here you have a flat table, and then you have round objects, and you can see the round objects which are fruits, they are treated almost like geometric spheres. If you remember what I said in the beginning, where he wanted to reduce everything into the geometric shapes. So, you see almost like he is painting these spheres, the solid spheres, and he is not representing the apple, for example, he is almost reconstructing the apple, right. So, by using his methodical brushwork, he is almost reconstructing the solid character of the apple. So, which is why when you look at the still lifes of Cézanne, you get a sense of 3D, three-dimensionality of the real objects. You get the sense of the gravity of the real objects. So, in this he actually disregarded the perspective, he did not quite follow the perspective, he actually it is a sort of a reverse. You see the unlike the conventional perspective, it is like the objects are coming onto the viewer, they are not like receding. So, he is not following the conventional perspective actually. So, he reinvented still life actually, right. So, and still life is very important for Cézanne because he could paint without any emotional attachment to it. And Cézanne painted like a monk, right, and he painted like as if he's analyzing the painting. Very calculated compositions, very balanced compositions, and the calculation, this balance and the analysis is the character of Cézanne's language, and that is what one of the aspects of post-impressionism. And this geometric approach and the analysis of forms led to the formation of cubism. He actually is the artist who influenced for the formation of cubism in the early 20th century, because he dissected, he almost analyzed the form and reconstructed the form on the canvas. So, which is why you need a lot of attention and time when you look at Cézanne's painting. Okay. It is not about representation, but it is reconstruction of a reality of itself, the pictorial reality of nature. It is not representing a landscape, but it is reconstructing the pictorial reality of a landscape. So, let us move to the other artist who is quite popular, quite famous, that is Vincent van Gogh. Cézanne was a French and Van Gogh was a Dutch artist. He came from Hague, and he was not a trained artist, he was sort of a self-taught artist. He was a very serious, silent and very thoughtful as a child, and he turned to religion when he sort of taken by depression, and he was influenced by the Protestant Christian practice, and he worked as an evangelist actually. So he went to these miners in Belgium, and he started staying there. It is then that he starts actually seriously paint and draw, and he used to preach them Bible. He used to recite Bible to these coal miners, coal miners, and there was a coal mine, and there were workers, and he used to, in the evening, he used to recite Bible to them. So he observed their bodies, he observed their lifestyle and their poor condition, and at that point of time he was influenced by Millet, Jean-François Millet, the realist painter. So his images were very much influenced by Millet's work, and the painting that you see, which is the famous Potato Eaters, 1885, this shows about the living conditions of these miners, and what they were eating for supper is the boiled potatoes and the dark coffee. So that was all what they had for meal. And if you look at the composition, it is very dramatic and very expressive. The light makes it look very Baroque-ish, where the light in the center lights up, and that is the only source of light. That the way the light is falling on the figures, and the kind of highlights, the way the highlights are treated, it makes it look very dramatic and very Baroque-ish. And he actually studied, he extensively studied these people, these workers, and in the next slide you can see separate studies, peasant women and different other, there are several drawings that he did in charcoal, particularly of coal miners and women in different activities, domestic activities and work. So these drawings and these studies were very much influenced by Jean-François Millet, and it informs, like, Millet's language of drawing, language of painting informed Van Gogh the way he looked at these coal miners, right? And he was really helpful towards them, and he was really touched by their suffering. So you can see the dark reality and and the poverty of these coal miners. And a particular kind of stylization also can be seen, the kind of bold brush marks, which is very much a character of the Dutch painting, and you can see that in Frans Hals, you can see that in Rembrandt. So that influence also can be seen reflected in this, apart from Millet's influence. So later he comes to Paris, and his art actually was also inspired by when he was working as an art dealer before he starts painting. So after that he goes to, he works as an art dealer in London, and then that's where he became depressed, and then he starts to painting, and then he goes to Belgium and he stays there. So that's how the story goes. And so he got a time for himself in Belgium to paint, and to become, to start as a painter. Then after that he moves to Paris, and he spent some time in Paris in around 85, 86. So in Paris that he got to encounter, see and meet different avant-garde artists of Paris, the Impressionists of the time, and he met Paul Gauguin, he met Lautrec, and he met various other Pierre Bernard, and various other artists, prominent artists of the time, and he was influenced by the Impressionist language. So suddenly there was a shift in his practice. The dark areas are washed away, and his paintings became more lighter and more influenced by the Impressionist color palette, right? So the dark areas, the browns, and the kind of light, the kind of darkened light and the Baroque-ish effect that he used to use was gone, and Impressionism had taken over his painting. And in this slide, the next slide that you see is a still life which is called Sunflowers, and he was very much influenced by sunflowers. He was very much taken by sunflowers, and this is a painting he painted a little later when he moved to Arles. What you see here is the flat background, right? There's no background, it's very flat, and you have sunflowers. Basically these sunflowers are dried sunflowers, right? And what you see here is the yellow used in different hues, and he was very much attracted to yellow actually, and that is what he said when he went to Arles. He said the light of this region, the southern region of France where Arles is located, the light is very much bright, and that light gives him energy and urges him to paint. So it is that light which is nothing but yellow actually. He created that light with the help of different shades and hues of yellow. So he released his depression, he released his seriousness through painting actually. He needed to paint to keep himself healthy mentally. If you look at this, it is a very simple sort of a still life, but when you look at the way the sunflowers are treated, there is certain amount of violence in them. The way the brush texture, the brush work and the movement of brush work is done. Though on the one hand the yellow color gives you a sense of freshness, but when you spend time and look at it, you see the flowers are dried. I mean, they are not the actual lively sunflowers, they are not kind of actual live flowers. So it is not that lively. There is certain amount of sadness, there is certain amount of intensity of emotion applied here. And he used drawing, as you can see, for the vase as a clear sort of outline, which is very different, because drawing could not be seen in the Impressionist context. So it is at this point of time when the artists were trying to kind of retain the drawing, So that is one of the important shifts also. So let us move to the next slide. So this is a sort of a landscape, right? It is called Suroor, again 1888, and this is a very interesting painting to understand what attracted Van Gogh in Arles. What you see is a Suroor pushed onto the right top, and the Suroor is very much like the Suroor that you will see in Millet. Millet also painted a Suroor like this. So the posture and the activity of Suroor, the figure character is very much taken from the Millet's painting, and it is located in this particular field. And if you go back, what you see is this bright yellow sun right in the center of the horizon. It is round, bright, and it is emanating these sun's rays, which are again yellow, right? So this kind of a yellow, and that is the color itself. He is not translating the sunlight into the actual environmental lighting up or the light. If you look carefully, he is painting sun rays, sun and the sunlight as an element in itself, as an object in itself. It is not something that is lighting up the landscape. It is not painted as if it is lighting up the landscape or an object, which was the case with the Impressionists, for example Monet. But here he is not painting sunlight or the light as a supplementary element, but sunlight in itself the central element, right? So, so it is a straight horizon and you have the sun, and your eye is directed towards the sun, right? What you have in the foreground is a sort of a path that takes you in, and it directly kind of allows you to look at the sun, right? So this attraction of the sun could be seen in Van Gogh's painting, in his composition particularly, you know, it takes you in. So this effect of drawing inside the painting, you know, this intensity of painting and the color and the intensity of emotion is the character of Van Gogh's painting. He is a contrast to what you have seen in Cézanne. If you look at Cézanne's painting, they are cold analysis, almost like a monk painting, no emotion, more a kind of an analysis of the painting. But when you look at Van Gogh, he maintains certain compositional stability. He is calculating the composition, but what is more evident is this intense emotion. They are loaded with the emotional intensity of the artist. So, so here you can see two different temperaments of the artist, two different individual temperaments of the artist, which is different from the Impressionist movement. So let us go look at the next slide. This is a portrait that he painted when he was living in Arles, and he and Gogan was living together. Gogan was asked by his brother Theo van Gogh, and Vincent van Gogh and Theo van Gogh were intimate, in the sense Theo was helping Vincent, he was sending money, and they used to write to each other, and Van Gogh used to talk to him about his paintings and his problems and various other things. So Van Gogh used to share, Vincent van Gogh used to share with his brother through letters. So Theo knew about about Van Gogh's, Vincent's problems. So he was alone and he needed some company. So Theo asked, because Theo was an art dealer and he was having money, and he knew many artists, and Theo asked Gauguin to spend some time with his brother, right? So both of them went to Arles and they spent some time and they started working. But theirs was not a very good friendship. I mean, they fought. They used to fight regarding many things, but they fought, and one evening Van Gogh had cut his ear. So this is the painting after that particular incident. So it's a self-portrait he's painting with the ear cut, ear with a bandage. And in the background you can see an easel, and interestingly on the right side what you have is a Japanese print, right? And you can see the intense emotion in his eyes, the kind of intensity in his gaze, the pain, the loadedness of his expression, all that is very much there. And his brushwork, the way the brush marks that that are visible, they kind of create a sense of violence, a sense of violent movement in the painting. So Japanese prints were very prominent at that point of time, and in the next slide you see an example of Japanese print. This is a copy of the Japanese print done by Van Gogh. Okay. So Japanese prints and Japanese artifacts were flooding Europe at this point of time, and particularly Paris. Japanese parasols, Japanese screens, fans, porcelain, and also the woodcut prints. So this is a Japanese woodcut print by Hiroshige, and Van Gogh had copied it. And many of the post-impressionist artists you can see were influenced by the Japanese woodcut prints, and drawing the line, the outline comes as an element from these woodcut prints. So this is an example, and you can see and also because Japanese prints he was closely observing, because his brother was selling Japanese prints. So if you look at the next slide, you will see the same kind of a compositional structure is adopted in this particular painting, right? Again, this is a 𝗧𝗧. The 𝗧𝗧 is pushed on to the left bottom, dark, and the canvas is cut diagonally using the trunk of the tree. And this kind of a close-up is very unusual in the context of European painting. This close-up comes from the Japanese prints, and the thing that you just saw, the kind of compositional close-up where the branch cuts across, or the tree trunk cuts across, and it's very much occupying a lot of frontal space of the painting. So this is the logic of Japanese composition. And again you can see the upper half of the background is yellow, right? And sun is occupying a large space, and it's not like a sun, almost like it's like something that is very solid, right? So this explains us about his interest in the light of this place, interest in that yellow light which gave him energy. And again you can see the way he's using the foreground, the composition of the landscape, it takes our eyes towards the sun, right? So this is again this is an example of how he's taking in the influences of Japanese prints. Moving on to the next slide of the same artist, Vincent van Gogh. This is bedroom that he painted in 1889. So this he painted in anticipation of his friend's visit, that is Gogan. So this he painted in 𝗚𝗏, it's bedroom in 𝗚𝗏, where you can see 2 pillows, 2 chairs, and you have 2 portraits on the wall. One is Van Gogh and one is supposed to be Gogan. So this he painted in an anticipation of his friendship, and you have a still life. So even here you have an effect of the way he has composed it, the way he has dramatized the perspective. And Van Gogh does this. He doesn't follow the perspective in sincerity, in its technical correctness, but he sort of dramatizes it, and you can see it takes you in, right? And this also had Japanese influence, where if you look at the still lifes were, you can see a strong bold outline and the flat application of color. There is no modeling in that. So that is a technique of image making, which is very much can be seen in the Japanese prints, the flat color and the outline. Let us look at the next painting, which is a very famous painting called the Starry Night. He painted this in the night, look at the way he has painted. So this is the time when he was almost at the end of his mental disturbance, like he was in asylum, and he was painting to just keep his mental health, to just survive. And these are the last days actually, and you can see his disturbance could be seen in the way that he painted the sky. You can see the cypress tree on the left side, which is like looking like flames almost in green patches, and the brushwork, the color patches become more and more visible. The sky becomes more violent and it is swirling, and you can see the moonlight is also yellow here, and the stars, the light of the stars are kind of having circular halos around them. So it's more a dramatic sort of a sky that we see here, and this is representative of his own emotional intensity and emotional sort of turmoil that he might be going through. And the last painting by Van Gogh is this, the next slide, which is the wheat field. Again, it's a very calculated composition. You have three ways in the center and very violent sort of brushwork, very animated brushwork, very visible brushwork. And what you have is three paths, and you are standing right in the center if you are standing in front of the painting, and you don't know where to go. And you have these crows that are coming from the horizon towards the viewer, right? And instead of the sun, you have a sort of a white patch in the center, like off center of course. So this painting is the last painting. Right after this painting, he shot himself and died, right? And that emotional disturbance, psychological disturbance that he might be having could be seen captured in this painting, the way the brushwork is done. And you are not allowed to go in if you spend time and look at this painting, because everything appears as if they are coming on to you, right? Unlike other paintings of Van Gogh where you can easily go in, where the horizon draws you in, here the horizon is actually coming on to you, right? So this is a very emblematic kind of painting which captures his end almost. It is the reverse of the life. It is the reverse of that energy that he saw in the sun, right? So next artist is his friend, I mean, Paul Gauguin. He was with Van Gogh in Arles, as I said, and they fought after some 6 months or so. So after, when Theo asked him, Gauguin goes and spends time with Van Gogh. So this is a painting that you see here on the screen. It's by Paul Gauguin. Gauguin's painting is more symbolic in nature. He becomes more symbolic at a later point of time. He started with conventional sort of painting, like, which is not also Impressionist but pre-Impressionist realist mode of painting. Later he was influenced by the Impressionist color, and you can see here in the red and the green application the bright color, right? So he, unlike Van Gogh, who paints in different brush marks, multiple brush marks, he paints with flat color, flat but bright colors, right? And this is the woman, Madame Guinot, for whom both Van Gogh and Gauguin actually had fought. And Van Gogh had cut his ear to gift it to this lady, right? So this cafe is again a very important cafe for both the artists, because they used to meet here and used to sort of spend time. And both of these artists were influenced from each other in terms of painting. So here this is by Gauguin, but the way the color is used in terms of the yellow particularly, it is very much like Van Gogh, right? It looks as if it is influenced by Van Gogh, the way the yellow is used in the center, right? So Gauguin was also influenced by religion. The next painting that you see on the screen is Visions After the Sermon. This is about Jacob fighting with an angel, and what you have here is the red background. In the foreground, you have this woman praying the celestial figures like Jacob, and the entire composition is divided into two with the branch that is cutting the composition into by a diagonal. This painting he did like when he went to the church and he happened to heard the story of Jacob and how he fought with the angel, and then he happened to see two people fighting on the street, right? So he quickly connected it, and he used symbolic sort of application of color here, where the red is both divine, but at the same time red is also violent, right? So what you see in the foreground is the backside of these two figures, and you can see a sense of movement where you have two the headgears of the two women you can see, and you can see the profile of another woman in the center, and you go back and you can see the clear profile, and so there is a sense of movement, and you have the other woman and they're praying, right? So this composition again is very much influenced by the Japanese prints, and you can compare it with what you have seen in Van Gogh and the Japanese print. So the composition is very close up. The two portions are divided, the divine imaginary on the top, where the terrestrial, the people, the human, the earth on the bottom. So he becomes symbolic with color, as we can see here, red becomes symbolic, right? So the next painting is Yellow Christ. The Yellow Christ, again the kind of yellow that you see here, you can see Van Gogh's influence, but here the yellow is not randomly or violently treated like the Van Gogh. This is like a very interesting painting where you can see in the context of Renaissance and before, where crucifix had been a very common popular theme, right? Here Christ, the crucifixion is in the center, and what you have in the context of crucifixion conventionally, you have Mary and you have other figures participating, you have other figures mourning in it. And sometimes you have a background, or sometimes you have not a background. But here you have a background which is very much like the local landscape, local farmland. It's not landscape, but the farmland where you can see in the behind a farmer is crossing the fence maybe, or you can see the actual landscape, and you can see the woman sitting right in the bottom. They are praying and they are wearing the local garments. So it is more about the contemporary effect, a contemporary moment, than the religion. It's not about, doesn't give you the religious sentiment, but it is more about the pictorial dimension of the painting. Now, Paul Gauguin painted this particular image, which is more ornamental. Look at the way he's painting the forms in the lake, and the way he's painting the sky on the top, and right in the center you have a Tahitian idol, right? So Gauguin went to Tahiti several times, and he went there and he settled in Tahiti, right? And from there he painted Tahitian culture, Tahitian people, and sent the paintings to Paris. And in Paris they were sold for good money, right? So Gauguin called this anti-impressionist style, this style that you see, and he called it as syntheticism, right? Because it synthesized the subject in nature with the artist's feeling about the subject, expressed through abstracted line, shape, space and color. So unlike representation of nature, he is manipulating it, right? He's expressing his own feelings with the help of the formal elements like line, shape, color and space, right? So this is having a Tahitian subject in the center, but painted in France after he returned from South Pacific. So he, as I said, he traveled several times, right? And he went to Tahiti to find the paradise. So he started very late. He was a stockbroker, and he started painting in his 30s, around 32, 34, right? So after he started painting, he wanted to travel, and he was attracted to these exotic places, right? So Tahiti was the one who which attracted him. And let us move to the next slide, which is the last painting by Gogan, which is a sort of a philosophical painting and very famous. It is titled as "Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going?" And this is a painting where it captures the kind of a movement from life to death, right? You can see on the right you have a small child, you have a couple, so the child is just born, it is the life, it is the beginning of the life, and you can move, and in the center you have this adult man who is standing, who is plucking the apple. So, or he's plucking something which looks like he's a figure of Adam, and you have behind it you have a figure which could be Eve or not. So there is a sense of ambiguity, and you move slowly, and on the left side you have an old figure sitting, and after that you have a pigeon, sort of a bird stylized in representation. So this is a movement from the beginning to the end of the life, and it is more like a philosophical question that he is asking, right? And if you look at the background is very interesting. You have a Tahitian idol, the goddess at the back, and the foliage, the trees and the landscape is represented as if it is like a Japanese landscape, and the forms, the treatment of the forms and the landscape looks very much similar to the Japanese woodcut prints, right? So it's a very large painting and a sort of a philosophical painting. And the next artist quickly to move is Lothar. Lothar painted in Paris, and unlike the other artists who traveled outside from Paris, Lothar came into Paris and he painted the Parisian culture, particularly of the dancers, the ballet dancers, of the cafe and of the brothels particularly. And this painting that you see is a prostitute, and she is removing her slacks, and on the left side you have a woman, maybe a pimp or maybe the authoritarian figure in that brothel, and look at her expression, very crooked, very evil sort of an expression, right? So Lothar is the artist who captured the physical decay, who captured the reality of this particular these particular people, right? On the stage they have a very beautiful expressions, right? They entertain people, right? So they create a sense of happiness, but behind the curtain, so Lothar had access to behind the curtain because he was allowed to move into the personal chambers of these prostitutes. So Lothar were friends with some of these prostitutes, and Lothar used them, like they were his models also. So he could actually see the real life and the suffering of these people who would entertain the bourgeois class and who would cater to the sexual needs of the bourgeois class, right? So how these women were exploited and how their bodies were diseased, If you look at his nude particularly, and you look at this particular nude, look at her body. It is not a beautiful body, right? It is not a beautiful nude like you have seen in Manet, or before that you have seen in Titian, or the entire Baroque, or Rococo. You don't see this figure as a beautiful figure, beautiful nude. It is more like the dilapidating flesh, right? So this is very important. This particular realism that Lothar introduced at this point of time is very important to notice when you look at Lothar. And this particular slide, the next slide, the instruction of the new ones by Valentine the Boneless. Valentine was a dancer and she is instructing here. And look at the crowd. This could be in Moulin Rouge. Moulin Rouge was a very famous cafe where artists used to sit, writers used to sit, and then they used to sketch. That was a meeting point. And so Valentine was a famous dancer, and it's a display, it's a kind of instruction of the dance, and you can see how people are looking at it. And you can also notice the dramatic artificial expressions of the people, right? So Lothar was a printmaker also. He sort of introduced new methods of printing posters. So he used to print posters for ballets and theaters and different kinds of things that were happening in Moulin Rouge and other places over there. It was that time when color lithography was introduced. So he used color lithography and used multiple colors, and he created very interesting posters like this, where with the outline, with the free-flowing outline and the flat color, which is very much like Japanese woodcut prints in the compositional appeal. And also the way he would cut, the way he would compose, where for example in this slide you have the figure standing right or jetting out right from the bottom, which is very much like a Japanese sort of composition, and you have a silhouette at the background of the people, and right in the center maybe Valentina dancing and showing a dance, and this is about a ballet in Moulin Rouge, right? So it's a very new kind of poster making that Lothar introduces at this point of time. And you have these put up at several places. And the last slide of Lothar is this: just observe. This is in the salon at Rue du Moulin, so which is Moulin Rouge. You just observe the people. This is also about inspection. Just look at the figure who is facing her back to us on the extreme right. She's holding her dress up and she's showing her naked bottom. So, and you have one figure waiting, and maybe these are prostitutes waiting for their clients. And look at their expressions, look at their body language. There is no hope in their eyes. It's more about this sadness that captures the entire environment, and Lothar had captured this psychological and emotional sort of condition of these ladies. Let us move to the last artist, Georges Seurat. Seurat was a very calculated artist. He composed paintings with a very, with geometric calculation. Okay, so for example, this, which is called Bathers, he painted in 1883-84, and he painted very few paintings, but he would take a long time to compose them. Right in the center you have a figure, right, and sitting, and on either sides of the figure you have two figures, right? One figure in the water, another figure wearing a hat at the back, right? All of them are directed in the same direction, looking at the same direction, right? Turning in the same direction, right? And in between these two, as you can see, in between these two, one figure in the water and one on the edge, in between these two, one figure is turned back, right? So this particular movement of the gaze is sort of held by this figure that is turning back, right? And the sort of bank that you see, the edge of the river, is making a diagonal from bottom to top, right? And that diagonal can be seen resonated in this particular figure, the figure who is reclining on the left side, on the foreground, right? So there is this sense of repetition, there is this sense of resonance of one form into another, right? It is very calculated, right? So if you go back into the horizon, you have a straight horizon, and on either sides you have the foliage, painted. So Seurat is the artist who would calculate each and every motif, who would with a geometric precision, right? And this repetition is also part of that geometric precision, right? So, and he is also known as pointillist because he is the artist who used the scientific theory of color, and he did not mix the colors on the palette. He used dots of primary colors. For example, in this next painting that you see here, he would use for the green, he would use the yellow as well as the blue. The dots of yellow and the dots of blue, they are juxtaposed together. When you look from a distance, they come together, they mix in your eye and they become green, right? If you look closely, you see the dots very clearly, right? So this is very much a logic that you see in the Impressionism also. But what Seurat did is, Seurat has actually made compositions a very calculated, analytical and mathematical sort of compositions, right? Not fleeting. Like here also you can see the figures that are standing on the left side. This is called the Sunday. This is the same, it is actually the river. This is the other side of the bank. So on either sides of the bank, you have one side, you have these working class factory going people that you have just seen in the last slide. Here you can see it is more like the bourgeois class, right? You can see women holding parasols. So these two paintings talk about two different classes and their lifestyle. Here nobody is bathing, nobody is in water, but they are looking at the water, looking at the river. So it is about the leisure, right? So you have two people, a couple standing on the left side and they are holding a dog, and you have another dog over there, and in the foreground you have figures turning towards the left side, right? And right in the center, if you go back, echoing these two figures who are standing, you have two figures standing right in the center and turning towards you, right? And if you go back again, you have one figure standing on the edge of the river, right? So you have this sort of echo, and you have these groups of people. If you spend time and look at it, you have these groups of people, forming a sort of geometric associations, right? So he introduced a sense of geometric composition, a sense of stability and staticness. You can see in this painting as if it is still, as if the figures are still, they are not moving, as if they are almost live sculptures, right? So there is a sense of tranquility in it, right? It is not, there is no noise like you see in the other earlier times, right? So he actually was satirizing the Parisian middle class, middle class culture, right? So that you can see in this sort of figure painting, where the figures are like statues, they are uncommunicative, they are not like what you saw in Lothar or Gogan or Van Gogh. They look like faceless, anonymous, right? So this is a kind of reality that he is sort of reflecting of a particular class. And the last slide is this, where it is a circus, and you look at the composition, and circus, cafes, ballets were very important at this point of time. They were flourishing, and you have one figure, the pipe player, right in the center, and you have the accompanying figures, and you have a horizontal line, and you have a vertical line, and you can see here the vertical and horizontal are balanced into a sort of a network, right? So we have seen a range of different kinds of approaches to painting, different languages that were introduced by these artists using the individual temperaments, and this is very important when you look at post-impressionism. Thank you.